He's not breathing. Clara's voice cracked as rain poured down the alley, her trembling hands pressing against the chest of a man in a silk suit. Somewhere across the city, a phone rang once before a deep, commanding voice answered. "Where did you find him? Not who, not how, just where?" Clara hesitated, staring at the gold-embossed card in her hand. The name on it, Duca, meant nothing to her. But to the man on the line, it meant war. As thunder rolled overhead, she realized too late this wasn't just an emergency call. It was a summons into a world where mercy was a weakness and kindness had a price. The neon sign of Murphy's Diner flickered weakly against the darkness, casting eerie shadows across the wet pavement. Clara Martinez pulled her thin jacket tighter around her shoulders as she stepped into the cold October night. Her feet ached from the 12-hour shift, and the smell of grease and desperation still clung to her uniform like a second skin. At 26, Clara had learned that life rarely offered surprises, at least not the good kind. Her world was measured in dollar tips, overdue rent notices, and the endless cycle of sleep work repeat. The diner paid just enough to keep her afloat in her studio apartment where the radiator coughed more than it heated, and the walls were paper thin. She fumbled for her phone to check the time. 2:17 a.m. The last bus had already left, which meant another 40-minute walk home through streets that grew more dangerous with each passing block. Clara sighed, watching her breath form small clouds in the frigid air. As she turned into the narrow alley beside the diner, a shortcut she'd taken countless times, something made her stop. There, crumpled against the brick wall like discarded trash, lay a man. Her first instinct was to keep walking. This neighborhood saw its share of drunks and addicts, and getting involved usually meant trouble. But something was different about this one. Even in the dim light from the street lamp, she could see he wasn't dressed like the usual casualties of the night. His suit was expensive, the kind she'd only seen on television or when serving the occasional business customer who'd wandered into the wrong part of town. The fabric looked Italian, maybe silk blend, and even soaked through with rain. It held its shape. His shoes were leather polished to a mirror shine despite the puddles. Clara approached cautiously, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Sir, are you okay?" No response. The man's face was turned away from her dark hair plastered to his forehead. She could see he was young, probably around her age, with strong features and olive skin. But his stillness terrified her, the kind of stillness that made you wonder if someone was breathing at all. "Sir." She raised her voice, shaking his shoulder gently. His head lolled to the side, revealing a face that was handsome even in unconsciousness. But there was something wrong. His lips had a bluish tint, and his breathing was so shallow she had to lean close to detect it. Panic shot through her. This wasn't a drunk sleeping it off. This man was dying. Clara's hands trembled as she checked his pockets for identification, trying to ignore how invasive it felt. His wallet was genuine leather, thick with cash, more money than she made in 2 months. But it was the name on the driver's license that made her freeze. Marco Duca. The name meant nothing to her, but tucked behind the license was a business card unlike any she'd ever seen. Heavy card stock, no business name, no address, just a phone number embossed in gold lettering. On the back, written in elegant script. In case of emergency, Clara stared at the card, her mind racing. Who is this man? Why did he carry a card like this? And why was he unconscious in an alley in the worst part of the city? The rain was getting heavier, and Marco's breathing seemed to grow more labored with each passing minute. Whatever was wrong with him, he needed help immediately. The nearest hospital was 15 minutes away by ambulance, if she could even get one to come to this neighborhood quickly. But the card, it felt like a lifeline thrown in the dark. With shaking fingers, Clara dialed the number. The phone rang once, twice. "Who is this?" The voice that answered was deep, commanding, and carried the kind of authority that made her spine straighten instinctively. Even through the phone, she could sense the power behind those 3 words. I, I found someone, Clara stammered, suddenly aware of how small her voice sounded. Marco Duca. He's unconscious, and I think he's really hurt. The silence that followed stretched so long she wondered if the call had dropped. When the voice came back, it had changed colder, harder, dangerous. Where? It wasn't a question. It was a command that beaked no argument. The alley next to Murphy's Diner on Riverside Avenue, Clara said quickly. He's barely breathing and his lips are turning blue. I think he might have been. Stay exactly where you are. The voice cut through her words like a blade. Do not move. Do not call anyone else. Do not let anyone near him. I'm coming. The line went dead. Clara stared at her phone, a chill running through her that had nothing to do with the October wind. The voice on the other end hadn't asked questions about hospitals or ambulances. He had given orders with the expectation of absolute obedience. And somehow, despite every rational thought screaming at her to call 911 and walk away, she found herself kneeling back down beside Marco. She pulled off her jacket and draped it over his chest, trying to shield him from the worst of the rain. His skin felt cold to the touch, but she could still detect a pulse at his wrist, weak but steady. Whatever had happened to him, he was fighting to stay alive. Come on, she whispered more to herself than to him. Whatever you are, whoever you are, just hold on. The minutes crawled by like hours. Clara found herself checking her phone obsessively. 2:31, 2:32, 2:33. Each second felt like an eternity, and she began to wonder if she'd made a terrible mistake. What if the person on the phone was dangerous? What if Marco was involved in something illegal and she just painted a target on her own back? But then she looked down at his face, so young, so vulnerable in unconsciousness, and her doubts wavered. Whatever he was, whatever he'd done, he was someone's son, someone's brother maybe, and right now he was just a man who needed help. At exactly 2:37 a.m., the sound of engines shattered the night silence. Clara's head snapped up as she heard them. Not one car, but several moving fast through the empty streets. The sound grew louder, echoing off the buildings like thunder until bright headlights flooded the mouth of the alley. She squinted against the glare, her heart pounding so hard she could barely breathe. Car doors slammed shut in rapid succession. 1, 2, 3, 4. Footsteps approached heavy and deliberate, and she realized with growing terror that she'd stepped into something far bigger and more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. The silhouettes of men appeared at the edge of the light, moving with the kind of coordination that spoke of training and purpose, and at their center a figure that seemed to command the very air around him stepped forward into the alley. Clara had never seen him before, but somehow she knew with absolute certainty that this was the man she'd spoken to on the phone. He was tall, probably in his 50s, with silver threading through dark hair and eyes that seemed to cut through the darkness. His coat was expensive, his bearing that of a man accustomed to power and getting exactly what he wanted. As he approached, Clara felt every instinct screaming at her to run. But Marco's unconscious form beside her anchored her to the spot, and she realized with a mixture of fear and determination that there was no going back now. She had made the call. She had stepped into this world. And now, as the most terrifying man she'd ever encountered, strode, tore her through the rain-soaked alley. Clara Martinez understood that her life would never be the same again. The man moved through the alley like he owned not just the ground beneath his feet, but the very air around him. His dark eyes swept over Clara with the intensity of a predator sizing up prey, and she felt herself shrinking under his gaze, despite her best efforts to remain calm. You... His voice was the same commanding tone from the phone, but in person it carried even more weight. You found him. It wasn't a question. Clara nodded anyway, her throat too dry to speak. Behind him, she counted at least 6 men, all dressed in dark suits despite the late hour. They positioned themselves around the alley entrance with military precision, and she noticed the subtle bulges beneath their jackets that made her stomach clench with fear. The man, whoever he was, dropped to his knees beside Marco with surprising gentleness for someone who radiated such menace. His hands moved over his son's body with practiced efficiency, checking pulse points and breathing. When he lifted Marco's eyelid to check his pupil response, Clara saw his jaw tighten. "How long has he been like this?" The question cracked like a whip. "I don't know," Clara managed. "I found him maybe 20 minutes ago. He was already unconscious." Those dark eyes fixed on her again, and Clara felt like she was being dissected. "What did you see anyone else around? Any cars leaving nothing?" she said quickly. "The alley was empty when I came through. I was just trying to get home from work and I saw him lying there." Work. He glanced at her uniform, taking in the grease stains and the Murphy's Diner logo. A waitress. The way he said it made Clara's cheeks burn. She'd heard that tone before, the subtle dismissal that came with being poor, being nobody. But this time it carried something else. Suspicion. "What's your name, Clara Martinez?" "Clara Martinez." He repeated slowly, like he was filing it away. "And you just happened to find my son in this alley. You just happened to have the kindness to call the number on his emergency card instead of robbing him blind or leaving him to die." His words hit her like physical blows. "I would never. People in this neighborhood would sell their own mothers for $50, he continued, his voice deadly quiet. "But you, a poor waitress working the graveyard shift, you risk your own safety to help a stranger." Clara realized what he was implying and felt anger override her fear. "You think I did this to him? You think I hurt him and then called you?" "I think," the man said, rising to his full height, "that coincidences in my world usually end with body bags." One of his men stepped forward, hand moving toward his jacket, but a sharp gesture stopped him. The alley fell silent except for the sound of rain hitting pavement and Marco's labored breathing. Just then, another car arrived. This one an unmarked sedan that Clara somehow knew carried medical equipment. A man in his 60s hurried over carrying a bag that looked more sophisticated than anything she'd seen at the local emergency room. "Dr. Reeves," the older man said, without taking his eyes off Clara. "He's been unconscious for at least 20 minutes. Possible poisoning." The doctor immediately went to work checking Marco's vitals and drawing blood samples with equipment that definitely wasn't standard issue. Clara watched in fascination as he worked, wondering what kind of doctor made house calls in the middle of the night to crime scenes. "Donuka," the doctor said after several tense minutes, and Clara's blood turned to ice. She'd heard that name whispered in the diner sometimes, usually followed by crossed fingers and worried glances. Don Vincent Aluka, the most feared man in the city's underworld. "It's definitely poisoning," Dr. Reeves continued. "Something slipped into his drink, I'd guess, but it's not lethal. Whoever did this wanted him unconscious, not dead. If you'd found him an hour later, he trailed off meaningfully." Don Duca's gaze swung back to Clara, and she saw something shift in his expression. The suspicion was still there, but it was mixed now with something else calculation. "You saved his life," he said simply. Clara didn't know how to respond to that. The fear was still there, but now it was mixed with confusion. Anyone would have. No, his voice cut through her protest. Anyone would have stepped over him and kept walking. Anyone would have taken his wallet and left him to die. But you called me. Two of his men carefully lifted Marco, carrying him toward one of the waiting cars with a kind of reverence usually reserved for royalty. The doctor followed, still monitoring the unconscious young man. Don Duca studied Clara for a long moment, and she felt like he was seeing straight through to her soul. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, but somehow more terrifying than before. "You've done something tonight that I won't forget, Miss Martinez. But you've also seen something, heard, something that makes you dangerous to people who would use that information against me." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. "I won't tell anyone. I swear. I believe you," he said, which somehow didn't make her feel better. But belief and survival are different things in my world. He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his expensive cologne and see the flecks of silver in his dark hair. Walk away, he said quietly. Go back to your diner, your tips, your small life. Forget you ever saw Marco Duca. Forget this alley, this night, this conversation. Because if you don't, if I hear your name connected to mine in any way, there won't be enough of you left to identify. The threat hung in the air between them like a blade. Clara nodded quickly, not trusting herself to speak. Danuka studied her face one last time, then turned and walked toward the cars. Just before he reached them, he paused and looked back. Miss Martinez, thank you. And then he was gone, taking his men and his unconscious son with him, leaving Clara alone in the rain-soaked alley with nothing but the memory of the most terrifying 20 minutes of her life. 3 days passed before Clara could sleep through the night without jolting awake at every sound. She'd followed Don Duca's warning to the letter, hadn't breathed a word about that night to anyone, not even her co-worker Janet, who noticed the dark circles under her eyes and kept asking if she was feeling all right. Clara threw herself into work with desperate intensity, as if the familiar routine of taking orders and refilling coffee cups could somehow erase the memory of those cold, calculating eyes. She picked up extra shifts, stayed late to help with inventory, anything to avoid being alone with her thoughts. It was Tuesday afternoon during the lunch rush when her carefully constructed normally shattered. She was wiping down table 6 when Janet appeared at her elbow, eyes wide with excitement. Clara, there's a guy at table 12 asking for you specifically. And honey, he's driving a car that costs more than I make in 5 years. Clara's blood turned to ice through the grimy window of the diner. She could see it. A sleek black sedan with tinted windows. The kind of car that didn't belong in this neighborhood unless it was bringing trouble. Did he give you a name? She asked, her voice barely steady. Marco something. Italian sounding. Janet grinned. And he's gorgeous. What aren't you telling me, girl? Clara's legs felt like rubber as she turned toward table 12. There he sat, looking completely out of place among the cracked vinyl booze and flickering fluorescent lights. Marco Duca was even more striking conscious than he'd been unconscious in the alley. Dark hair, perfectly styled olive skin, healthy and vibrant, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her rent. But it was his eyes that caught her. Warm brown eyes that held intelligence, humor, and something else she couldn't quite identify. When he saw her approaching, he smiled, and the expression transformed his entire face. Cara Martinez, he said, standing as she reached his table. The gesture was so unexpected, so formal in the casual chaos of Murphy's diner, that several other customers turned to stare. Mr. Duca? She kept her voice low, acutely aware of Janet hovering nearby, pretending to clean the same spot on the counter for the 3rd time. You shouldn't be here. Please sit. He gestured to the booth across from him. We need to talk. Clara glanced around the diner, noting how conversation had died down as people tried to eavesdrop. The last thing she needed was to become the subject of neighborhood gossip. I'm working. I've already spoken to your manager. You have a break coming. The casual way he said it, like arranging her schedule, was as simple as ordering coffee, sent a shiver down her spine. This was what power looked like. She realized not the obvious threat his father had wielded, but the quiet ability to rearrange the world to suit your needs. Reluctantly, she slid into the booth across from him. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought, maybe 28 at most. But there was something in his eyes that spoke of experiences far beyond his years. How are you feeling? She asked, surprising herself with a genuine concern in her voice. Marco's smile widened. Much better thanks to you. The doctor said if you'd found me even an hour later, he let the sentence hang, then leaned forward. You saved my life, Clara. That's not something I take lightly. Your father already thanked me and warned me. The memory of Don Duca's threat made her shift uncomfortably. I kept my end of the bargain. I didn't tell anyone. I know, but gratitude and warnings are different things. Marco reached into his jacket and Clara tensed involuntarily, but instead of a weapon, he pulled out a white envelope. "This is for you." Clara stared at the envelope like it might bite her. "What is it?" "Call it a thank you gift. Your tip jar doesn't exactly scream financial security." The casual observation about her poverty stung, even though it was true. "I don't want your money. It's not about what you want," Marco said gently. "It's about what you deserve. Do you have any idea who I am, what my family is worth? I know enough to want nothing to do with it." Clara pushed the envelope back across the table. "Your father made it very clear that staying away was the smart choice." Marco's expression grew serious. "My father sees threats everywhere. It's how he survived this long, but sometimes he misses the good things right in front of him." There was something in his tone that made Clara look at him more carefully. Beneath the expensive suit and confident demeanor, she caught a glimpse of something vulnerable, a young man struggling against expectations he'd never chosen. "Come with me," he said suddenly. "What, just for a few hours? Let me properly thank you. Show you something beautiful instead of—" He gestured around the diner, taking in the stained ceiling tiles and broken air conditioning unit. Clara shook her head. "I can't." "Your father." "My father doesn't run my life," Marco said, and for the first time she heard steel in his voice. "And he certainly doesn't decide who I'm grateful to." The challenge in his words was unmistakable. Clara realized she was witnessing something she probably shouldn't. A glimpse into the family dynamics of one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the city, where she heard herself ask, and immediately wondered if she'd lost her mind. "My home just to see it meet some people have a decent meal. You'll be back before your next shift, I promise." Clara looked around the diner again at the grease-stained walls, the customers counting change for coffee, the life she'd been living for years without really living at all. Then she looked back at Marco, whose warm eyes held an invitation to something completely different. "1 hour," she said finally, "and then I come back here and we pretend this conversation never happened." Marco's smile was brilliant. 1 hour, he agreed. But something in his expression suggested he had no intention of letting her walk away so easily. As Clara untied her apron and followed him toward that expensive car, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was making a mistake that would change everything. But for the first time in years, the unknown felt more appealing than the safety of her small, predictable world. The car door closed behind her with a soft sound of luxury, and Clara Martinez found herself being driven toward a life she'd only ever seen in movies, and all the dangers that came with it. The Duca mansion had been everything Clara expected, and nothing she was prepared for. Marble floors that reflected crystal chandeliers, artwork that belonged in museums and rooms larger than her entire apartment. Marco had been the perfect host, charming, attentive, and surprisingly down-to-earth, despite the opulence surrounding him. But it was Don Duca's watchful presence that had made her skin crawl. He had said nothing during the brief introduction, just studied her with those calculating eyes as if trying to solve a puzzle. Even when he'd excused himself for business, Clara felt like she was being observed, judged, weighed, and found wanting. Now, walking home through the familiar streets of her neighborhood, Clara tried to process what she'd experienced. The contrast was jarring. From silk curtains and gourmet food back to cracked sidewalks and the smell of garbage. But what disturbed her most wasn't the wealth itself. It was how natural Marco had seemed in it. How easily he moved between kindness and the casual mention of things that made her blood run cold. She was 3 blocks from her apartment when she noticed the footsteps behind her. At first, Clara thought it was paranoia, a side effect of spending the afternoon in a world where danger lurked behind every smile. But as she turned onto Maple Street, the footsteps turned too. When she quickened her pace, they matched her rhythm. Her heart began to pound. The street was poorly lit, with half the street lights burned out and the others casting weak, flickering pools of yellow light. The shadows between them seemed deeper than usual, full of possibilities she didn't want to consider. Clara forced herself to stay calm. This was her neighborhood. She'd walked these streets hundreds of times. But tonight felt different, charged with menace that made every shadow a potential threat. "Hey, pretty lady!" The voice came from ahead of her, not behind, and Clara's stomach dropped. A man stepped out from between two parked cars, blocking her path. He was tall, heavy-set, with a kind of cruel smile that meant trouble. Clara spun around looking for escape, but two more men had materialized from the shadows behind her. They moved with a coordinated precision of people who'd done this before. "We just want to talk," said the first man, taking a step closer, "about your new friends." "I don't know what you're talking about." Clara managed proud that her voice didn't shake. "Sure you do." Another man, thin with dead eyes, circled to her left. "Pretty Waitress saves the Duca, boy. Word gets around fast in this business." Clara's blood turned to ice. "I don't know any Ducas," the big man laughed, a sound like gravel in a cement mixer. "That's funny because you were just at their house. Nice car ride from what we heard." They'd been watching her probably for days. Clara realized with growing horror that Don Duca's warning hadn't been paranoia. It had been prophecy. "What do you want?" she asked, backing against a parked car. "Information," said the thin man. "About the security at the mansion, about Don Duca's routines, about his precious son's recovery." "I don't know anything about security. I was there for an hour. An hour's enough to see plenty." The big man pulled something from his jacket. Not a gun, but a knife that caught the streetlight with deadly promise. "The question is whether you're going to tell us willingly or whether we need to get creative." Clara's mind raced. She could scream, but who would help her in this neighborhood at this hour? She could run, but they'd position themselves to cut off every escape route. Her phone was in her purse, but reaching for it would probably earn her a blade between the ribs. "I swear I don't know anything useful," she said desperately. "I'm nobody. I serve coffee and clean tables. Nobody who saves Marco Duca." The third man spoke for the first time, his accent thick and Eastern European. "Nobody who gets invited to family dinners." The knife moved closer, and Clara closed her eyes, preparing for pain. The sound of squealing tires filled the night air. Clara's eyes snapped open to see headlights flooding the street, moving fast and getting faster. The three men spun toward the approaching vehicles. Plural, she realized, as a second car rounded the corner behind the first. The big man snarled, "Move!" But it was too late. The first car skidded to a stop, doors flying open before it had fully stopped moving. Men in dark suits poured out, and Clara recognized the military precision she'd seen in the alley 3 nights ago. Marco appeared from the lead car, and the transformation was startling. Gone was the charming young man who bought her lunch. In his place was someone harder, more dangerous, someone who belonged in this world of violence and threats. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying a chill that made Clara shiver. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." The 3 attackers had drawn weapons guns this time, not knives, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Clara could see the calculation in their eyes the moment they realized they'd made a fatal miscalculation. "This isn't over, Duca." The thin man called out, but he was already backing away. "The Kozlov family doesn't forget. Neither do we." Marco replied, and something in his tone made the men turn and run. Clara watched them disappear into the night, her legs finally giving out. She slumped against the car behind her, shaking with delayed shock and adrenaline. Marco was beside her instantly, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Clara, are you hurt?" She shook her head, not trusting her voice. The concerned young man was back, but she'd seen the other version now, the one who could make hardened criminals run with just his voice. "How did you know?" she finally managed. "We've been watching you," he said simply. "My father was right. Saving me put you in danger. I couldn't let anything happen to you." Clara looked at him, really looked, and saw the truth in his eyes. This wasn't coincidence or luck. This was protection, the kind that came with a price she was only beginning to understand. "I want to go home," she whispered. "I know," Marco said gently, "but Clara home isn't safe anymore, not until we deal with this." As his men secured the area and Clara sat in the back of Marco's car, she realized that Don Duca's warning had come too late. She was already in too deep, and the only way out was through a world that would either protect her or destroy her. The choice she was beginning to understand was no longer hers to make. The safe house wasn't what Clara expected. Instead of some grim warehouse or underground bunker, Marco brought her to a penthouse apartment overlooking the harbor. Florida ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city lights reflecting on the water, while modern furniture and soft lighting created an atmosphere more suited to a romantic getaway than protective custody. "You'll be safe here," Marco said, setting her bag down in the spacious living room. "The building has security, and my men will be watching the entrances." Clara stood at the window, trying to process how quickly her life had unraveled. 12 hours ago, she'd been serving coffee and worrying about rent. Now she was hiding from Russian mobsters in a penthouse that probably costs more per month than she made in a year. "Why did they call themselves the Kozlov family?" she asked without turning around. Marco was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "Because that's who they work for. Viktor Klov runs the Russian operations in the city. And they want to hurt your father. They want to replace my father," Marco corrected. "There's a difference. In our world, elimination isn't always about death. Sometimes it's about making someone irrelevant." Clara turned to face him. "Our world." Marco had loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves, making him look younger, more approachable. But there was tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there at the diner. The family business, he said simply, "Which is Marco," moved to the bar and poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey. He offered her a glass, but she shook her head. "Import and export," he said. "Transportation, security, consulting, real estate development." Clara had heard enough euphemisms to recognize them, and the illegal parts, Marco's smile was Rofal. "You really want to know? I think I've earned the right to know what I'm hiding from." He drank half the whiskey in one swallow, then set the glass down with deliberate precision. "My poisoning wasn't random, Clara. It was a message." "What kind of message?" "The kind that says the old man's getting weak if he can't even protect his own son." Marco moved to the couch, gesturing for her to join him. "Viktor Klov has been testing our defenses for months. Small things at first. Shipments going missing. Loyal businesses suddenly having code violations. Key allies receiving better offers from competitors." Clara perched on the edge of the opposite chair, maintaining distance. "So he poisoned you to prove a point." "He had someone poison me," Marco corrected. "Someone close enough to slip something in my drink without being noticed. Someone I trusted." The implications hit Clara like a physical blow. "Someone in your own organization. Someone in our own family." Marco's voice was barely above a whisper. "That's what makes this so dangerous. We don't know who we can trust." Clara studied his face, noting the pain that went beyond physical harm. "How do you live like that? Never knowing who might betray you." "You learn not to get close to people," Marco said. "You learn to keep your emotions locked away where they can't be used against you. Is that what you're doing with me? Keeping me at a distance?" Marco looked up sharply, and Clara saw something raw in his expression. "With you, it's the opposite problem." "What do you mean, I mean?" Marco said, standing and moving toward her. "That for the first time in my life, I met someone who helped me without wanting anything in return. Someone who looked at me and saw a person, not a name or a bank account, or a stepping stone to power." Clara's heart began to beat faster as he approached. "Marco, do you know what it's like to wonder if every smile is calculated, every conversation is an audition, every relationship is a transaction?" He knelt in front of her chair, his eyes intense. And then I wake up in a hospital bed and my father tells me that a waitress from Murphy's diner saved my life. Not because she knew who I was, but because it was the right thing to do. Anyone would have. No, Marco interrupted. Anyone wouldn't have. Most people in this city crossed the street to avoid getting involved. But you called the scariest man you'd never met and stayed in a dark alley with a stranger because you thought he might die. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. I couldn't just leave you there. I know. That's what makes you dangerous. Dangerous, Marco reached up to touch her face, his fingers gentle against her skin. Dangerous to me. Dangerous to everything I thought I knew about myself and what I wanted from life. Clara's breath caught. She could see the conflict in his eyes. Desire wearing with duty. Hope fighting against expectation. Your father expects you to take over the business, she said quietly. My father expects a lot of things, Marco's thumb traced along her cheekbone. He expects me to marry someone from an allied family. He expects me to expand our territory and eliminate our enemies. He expects me to become a version of himself. And what do you want? Marco was quiet for a long moment, his hand still cupping her face. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. I want to wake up next to someone who loves me, not my name. I want to build something instead of just inheriting it. I want to look in the mirror and recognize the person looking back at me. Marco Clara began, but he shook his head. I know it's impossible. I know asking you to be part of this world is selfish and dangerous and probably insane. His eyes searched her face. But if I walked away from all of this, if I found a way to leave the family business behind, would you consider walking with me? Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. Everything rational told her to say no, to demand he take her home, to disappear back into her small, safe life. But looking into his eyes, seeing the vulnerability he was offering her, she found herself considering possibilities she never dared to imagine. How? She whispered. How could you possibly walk away from all this? I don't know yet, Marco admitted. But knowing you exist, knowing there's someone worth walking toward, it makes me want to find a way. As he leaned closer and Clara felt herself drawn into his orbit, she realized that the most dangerous thing about Marco Duca wasn't his family's power or their enemies' threats. It was the way he made her believe that impossible things might just be possible after all. The call came at 3:00 in the morning, shattering the peaceful silence of the penthouse. Clara woke to find Marco already reaching for his phone, his face grim in the blue glow of the screen. What is it? Don Duca's voice was clear, even from across the room, sharp with urgency. We found him, Marco said simply, but Clara could see the tension in every line of his body. Clara sat up, pulling the silk robe tighter around herself. They'd spent the evening talking, really talking about everything from childhood dreams to impossible futures. Nothing had happened beyond gentle touches and lingering looks. But the connection between them had deepened into something that felt both fragile and unbreakable. I have to go, Marco said, ending the call. The trader Marco nodded, already reaching for his clothes. Tony Riachi. He's been with the family for 15 years. My father trusted him completely. Clara watched him dress, noting how he transformed before her eyes. The vulnerable man who talked about walking away from his life was disappearing, replaced by someone harder, more dangerous. What will happen to him? Marco paused in buttoning his shirt. What always happens to traitors? The casual way he said it sent ice through Clara's veins. This was the reality. She'd been dancing around for days. Marco wasn't just part of this world, he was heir to it. And in this world, betrayal had only one punishment. I should come with you, she said suddenly. Absolutely not. Marco's refusal was immediate and firm. This isn't something you need to see. But Clara was already getting dressed. If we're going to have any kind of future together, I need to understand who you really are. All of you. Marco studied her face for a long moment. Clara, once you see this, you can't unsee it. You can't pretend it's not part of who I am. I know. An hour later, Clara found herself in the basement of a warehouse she'd never seen before, surrounded by men whose faces she recognized from the alley that first night. The air smelled of concrete and fear, and the single overhead light cast harsh shadows that made everyone look like criminals. Tony Ritchie was tied to a chair in the center of the room, his face bloodied but his eyes defiant. He was older than Clara expected, maybe 50, with graying hair and the kind of weathered hands that spoke of a lifetime of manual labor. Don Duca stood before him like a judge pronouncing sentence. 15 years, Tony. 15 years you sat at my table, ate my food, called my son nephew. Times changed, Don, Tony spat. Clove offered a better future for 30 pieces of silver. The old man's voice was soft, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. You poisoned my son? I made him sleep, Tony corrected. Kozlov wanted him dead. I convinced him unconscious. Was enough to send the message. Clara felt Marco tense beside her. You convinced him. Tony looked directly at Marco for the first time. You think I wanted to hurt you, boy? I watched you grow up, but your father's way is dying. Clove represents the future. My father's way includes loyalty, Marco said quietly. Something you seem to have forgotten. What happened next took less than 10 seconds. But Clara felt like she was watching it in slow motion. Don Duca nodded to one of his men. The man stepped forward. Tony Ritchie closed his eyes. The sound echoed in the concrete space like thunder. Clara's knees buckled, but Marco caught her arm, studying her. She looked up at his face and saw no satisfaction, no cruelty, just the grim acceptance of someone who understood the rules of his world and followed them without question. It's over, Don Duca announced to the room. Tony made his choice. We've made ours. Later, back at the penthouse, Clara sat on the terrace overlooking the harbor, while Marco poured himself another whiskey. The city lights twinkled peacefully below them as if nothing had changed, as if a man hadn't died for his betrayal just hours before. Do you regret coming? Marco asked finally. Clara considered the question carefully. I regret that it was necessary, but I don't regret knowing who you really are. Marco set down his glass and moved to the railing beside her. And who am I? Someone who does terrible things for people he loves, Clara said quietly. Someone who would rather find another way, but knows there isn't always another way available. They stood in silence for several minutes, watching the boats move slowly across the dark water. The offer still stands. Marco said eventually, I could find a way out. We could disappear. Start over somewhere else, be nobody special in some small town where the biggest crime is jaywalking. Clara turned to look at him, seeing the hope and fear wearing in his expression. What about your father? Your responsibilities? My father built an empire, Marco said. But empires fall. Maybe it's time to build something smaller and more honest. Clara thought about her tiny apartment, her grease-stained uniform, the endless cycle of barely getting by that had defined her life until a week ago. Then she thought about Tony Ritchie and the sound that had ended his life. She thought about Victor Clove and men who saw her as a tool to be used or eliminated. But mostly she thought about Marco, the way he'd knelt in front of her chair and talked about wanting to recognize himself in the mirror. The way he'd asked her to walk with him toward an uncertain future. If you left, she said slowly, would you be able to live with yourself knowing you abandoned your father, your family, your responsibilities? Marco was quiet for a long moment. I don't know, he admitted. But I know I can't live with myself if I don't at least try to become someone worthy of you. Clara reached out and took his hand, feeling the calluses on his fingers, the strength in his grip. Then, let's find out together. Marco turned to stare at her, hope blazing in his dark eyes. You mean it? Instead of answering with words, Clara rose on her tiptoes and kissed him. It was gentle at first, tentative, but when his arms came around her, it deepened into something that tasted like possibility and promises. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Marco rested his forehead against hers. "There's no going back after this," he warned. "I know," Clara whispered, "but maybe going forward is better than going back anyway." As the sun began to rise over the harbor painting, the sky in shades of pink and gold, Clara Martinez made a choice that would define the rest of her life. She placed her hand over Marco Duca's heart and stepped into a future that was dangerous, uncertain, and more alive than anything she'd ever dared to imagine. The waitress who'd saved a stranger in an alley was gone forever. In her place stood a woman ready to fight for love no matter what it cost.